Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Today we all struggle to find time for the things we need to do. Our Google calendars, usually in multicolors, are kind of 21st century feats of human engineering. Perhaps the enduring popularity of the TV show Friends for young and old alike is because it evokes a simple time in the early 90s, before texts, emails, notifications, and all the new layers of modern life. It was an era when people could still find time to hang out, to happen into unstructured time with friends, without an agenda, just a time to chill and evolve human relationships. For most of us, that seems like a quaint remembrance of things past. Today, if we hang with friends at all, and polling shows we certainly are doing less of it with fewer friends, it is while multitasking, while viewing or participating in sporting events, attending concerts, doing something with kids, or something related to work. What many of us remember as the dorm room hangout, talk, music, drink till late into the night, seems to be the stuff of nostalgia. But should it be? What are we losing by giving up that unstructured time? And is hanging out with friends while thinking about that long to-do list simply a product-market mismatch? We're going to talk about all of this with my guest, Sheila Liming. Sheila is an associate professor at Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont, where she teaches classes on literature, media, and writing. She's the author of 2 previous books and is the editor of a new edition of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence. Her essays have appeared in numerous prestige publications, and her new book is Hanging Out, The Radical Power of Killing Time. Sheila Liming, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. It's lovely to be here.
Great to have you here. Define what you mean by hanging out, first of all.
Well, in the book, I define hanging out as daring to do not much and daring to do it in the company of other people. But what that translates to is this kind of idea of killing time and devoting the time that you're killing to social interaction. So not simply killing time in antisocial ways or isolating ways, but actually in the company of others.
Is hanging out the same if you're with friends and you're at a sporting event or a concert or watching kids?
Yeah, that's something that I try to, think about over the course of the whole book. And I look at different instances of hanging out or different kinds of hanging out and how they occur. And there are certain factors that shape those instances. So hanging out, with a friend while you're watching their kids is maybe not exactly the same as what you're doing when you're at a baseball game or at a concert. But the spirit is sort of similar, which is that, you're existing in physical proximity to other people and you're doing it without too much of a set agenda that dictates what's supposed to happen in that instance.
Are we hanging out less today, or are we simply doing it in ways that are different, in ways that accommodate the realities of modern life?
Well, we're hanging out a lot less in person, but we're hanging out a lot more on the internet. And so in some ways you could say that, maybe we're hanging out more than we ever have, but we're doing it in a more highly mediated sense through the use of these digital tools that surround us in our life. And one of the things I try to explore in the book is that kind of hanging out is actually quite different, that we have a different kind of connection to people when we're hanging out through those devices.
Talk about that, because in many ways today we hang out on Zoom or we hang out on social media, whereas perhaps many, many years ago we hung out on the telephone when we weren't in person. The way in which the medium by which we're hanging out impacts the nature of the relationship.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with control. And, when we're hanging out in the context of digital devices, there's often a feeling of control that comes with doing that. And sometimes that control is in one way or another sort of imagined, but in some ways it's very real. So for instance, if we're hanging out on a social media platform and talking to people and somebody says something that we don't really like, we can always exit that platform. We can turn away from the conversation, we can ignore what they're saying, or we can even go, to the extreme of blocking them so that we never have to talk to them again. The same is true, of course, on a Zoom call or even on a telephone call too. We can hang up on someone, we can end that conversation. The stakes of doing that are much higher when we're hanging out face to face with people, because if we try to exert those same mechanisms of control, there's going to be consequences, or we may be judged for our actions. So part of what I try to explore in the book is that hanging out in person is not subject to the same kinds of control that hanging out on the internet or via digital devices is. And that's part of what makes it so difficult and uncomfortable for us these days.
And part of what makes it uncomfortable, I suppose, is that there's a certain element of risk in doing it.
Yes, absolutely. That feeling that you don't necessarily get to control or dictate what's going to happen or what someone's going to say or how the events are going to proceed.
And is that risk intensified by the fact that time today at least seems to most people as so precious and so fragile that they can't afford the time to take that risk today?
Absolutely, yes. Where I live in Vermont, it's a sort of rural state, and a lot of people live somewhat spread apart, even though the state isn't that big. And one thing that I often notice here is that if you want to hang out with somebody, you got to make a reservation like months in advance, because there's going to be coordination that has to go into travel and taking time out of one's schedule and things like that. It's not a casual affair, and I think with all of that. With all that planning comes a greater sense that the risk needs to be worth the reward. And when there's a feeling that that might not happen, people tend to back out, or they're less likely to invest in the first place.
And also it's a question of how we establish the priorities. I mean, one of the things that I think happens is that when people make those plans in advance, months in advance, to hang out or go to a restaurant with somebody or go to a sporting event, that unless there's an economic stake involved, it becomes the easiest thing to cancel if something, quote unquote, more important comes along.
Exactly. Yeah. Especially if there's this sense like, well, that meeting won't necessarily get me anything, or it won't be productive in a particular way. It's just going to be us hanging out. And so, part of what I try to argue for in the book is that hanging out itself is very important. It's how we shore up our social networks and build our relationships with each other.
Talk about why it's important. Go a little deeper on that and what it does in terms of our social interactions. And one of the things you talk about that's so interesting is that the ability to hang out, the ability to have these social relationships is kind of a muscle that we have to exercise.
Exactly. Yeah. I think of hanging out as almost like social exercise. You do these activities and you build up your stamina, or you build up your musculature for doing it, so that the next time you do it, it's a little bit less taxing, or it's a little bit less exhausting. You get this, this stamina built up and this greater endurance that comes from it, which is part of what's important about it. The reverse of that, I think, happens when we spend a lot of time in isolation. We sort of lose those muscles, and we lose that flexibility and that stamina, so that each instance of hanging out or interacting with people becomes a little bit harder and a little bit more painful and a little bit more uncomfortable. So part of what I try to talk about in the book and argue for is the idea of that social exercise that comes through hanging out, which is not just good for us on a personal level, but it's also good for us in a social context and in the context of the democratic society that we live in.
One of the things that happened during the pandemic is that because of isolation, people got lazy, or they got out of the habit of that kind of social interaction. And like any kind of exercise, I suppose, it's easier once you're out of the habit or out of the rhythm to just not do it.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we all know that feeling of how hard it feels to return to doing something that used to be easy. And part of what feels hard in those instances is the reminder that it once was easier, that you could do it effortlessly. And now it feels like it takes so much pain, or it takes so much, effort on your part to do it.
The other part of it is that it takes so much planning. The appointment culture that we live in is such that it really takes a lot of planning to make those things happen.
It does, yeah. I have a couple of friends, who I struggle to see on a regular basis, even though I have the best intentions of seeing them on a regular basis. And one of them is even someone I work with. But in our normal working day, we do not see each other because we might even be working in the same building, but we're so busy with the things we have to do at work that we rarely get a moment to even talk to each other passing in the hallway. We're very, very scheduled in the things that we have to accomplish when we're in that environment. And then in the meantime, we keep trying to make a date to hang out with each other.
The other part of that is the degree to which we're geographically atomized, that people that may be friends that we might hang out with or might want to hang out with now live in another part of the country or another part of the world.
Exactly, yes. I grew up in the Seattle area, and I recall in the Seattle area when I was growing up there, my dad used to talk about how, he worked in downtown Seattle and he would make friends through work. But the people he knew for work, of course, did not live in downtown Seattle. They lived scattered about these other communities that were way in the hinterlands of the city, some of which could be an hour or more to access. So if you tried to hang out with somebody outside of work, there was an immense commitment that went into that in terms of like travel and planning and everything like that. And I think that's only become worse over the past several decades.
What do we see in terms of differences between gender differences hanging out and also single people versus couples?
That's an interesting question, and I'm glad you asked it. One thing I've noticed with relation to gender differences has come to me through the way that people have responded to the book. And I have been noticing that in reviews and in conversations I've had with people that I have received a much more enthusiastic response from women who maybe are socialized to prioritize some of these activities that I'm talking about in the book a little bit more so than men in some ways. And, even though the types of hanging out that I talk about in the book, things like parties and dinner parties and jamming with musicians or attending musical events or even hanging out at work, even those instances are themselves not gendered, I think there are gender dynamics to how this hanging out has to happen. And we often see that, of course, in relationships where, things get divided along gender lines and the men go hang out with the men or the women hang out with the women.
And talk a little bit about things like dinner parties where it's a larger group hanging out, perhaps.
Yeah, I love a good dinner party. And I talk about dinner parties in the book, but I don't just talk about the good ones. I also talk about some of the less good ones that I have attended over the years. And I do it, for the sake of thinking about what it is that we feel that we risk when we enter into a social environment like that. And often why things can go wrong or feel so uncomfortable or so tense in the context of a pretty simple event, which is, hanging out and eating a meal with other people. And I think sometimes what causes things to go wrong are big ideas and big expectations about what has to happen or what the outcome is supposed to be or how the event is supposed to unfold or even how people are supposed to act and get along at the event too. And I think sometimes that ends up sort of stymieing social relations that would happen. But, other times we go to a dinner party and we have a great time and we wish it would never end. And we're all sitting there around the table late into the night, still talking, and time is just slipping by and we don't even notice.
It does seem like the core thing that determines that, or certainly one of the core things, is what you touched on, expectation. And that seems to play such a large role.
Yeah. And I think that, going back to the topic of social musculature and social exercise, we tend to create larger expectations for social gatherings when we experience them infrequently. We sort of build them up to be like, well, if this is going to be my one chance this year that I get to see so-and-so, or the one time that I get to hang out in this particular way, everything needs to be perfect. It needs to look perfect. It needs to taste perfect. It needs to run perfectly. And that, of course, is a recipe for disappointment because nothing is ever perfect.
Another thing that you talk about that's so interesting is this idea of stories. And that by the more hanging out you do, the more experience you have, the more stories you have to tell at forthcoming hangouts. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think hanging out is itself mostly comprised of stories. It's about, first of all, swapping stories when you're hanging out with people around a dinner party or in, another kind of social gathering. A lot of what you do is you exchange stories. You tell a story, you listen to someone else's story, you say, oh, I had a similar experience once, and you offer your story, and conversation builds that way. But also in the act of hanging out, we're also creating stories often. So we have experiences, we learn from each other, we kind of pay those experiences and those conversations forward, and they become stories that we tell in a future gathering.
So does hanging out favor those people that are better at storytelling?
Oh, that is an interesting question. Perhaps. I will say maybe on one side, but at the same time, too, I think that successful hanging out is also about listening. And we've probably all had experiences when we are spending time in someone's company, and that other person is not a very good listener. And we feel like we could maybe just be, telling our stories to the air, or to no one at all, and we would have about the same effect. And that eventually, of course, works against the social camaraderie that could be built in that moment. So it is about being a good storyteller, but I think just as equally, it's about being a good listener.
Certainly one of the things that's different today is this sense of, and I sort of hate the cliche of it, but of being in the moment when you're hanging out or at a dinner party, whatever it is. But everybody has their phone out. Everybody's phone is handy, whether it's checking with the babysitter or whether it's a work call or whatever it may be. Everybody is still on guard for what might happen.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I agree that the cliche living in the moment, ends up feeling exactly like that, like a bit of cliche. But I suppose what's embedded in that statement is the advice to remember that you are in a particular place in a particular time, and there are people who are there in front of you. And you have a kind of primary responsibility and connection to those people as opposed to people who exist somewhere else. And maybe you do need to check in with those people or manage things. But living in the moment, becomes about like a willingness to pay attention to the people who are right there in front of you, as opposed to the hypothetical audience that exists somewhere else.
Except that everyone else that's there hanging out, whether it's a small group or a large group, is doing the same thing.
Yes. And it's contagious. I mean, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but the second one person sort of breaks the spell and picks up their phone,
Yep.
It just becomes this, the seal is broken and then everyone can do it. And then it just sort of builds from there. And pretty soon, we've all swiveled our attention away to someone else or somewhere else who's not there in the room with us, and we've stopped paying attention to each other.
Because there's also an ebb and flow to these things, as there is to conversation, where it goes dead for a while and then, maybe picks up again. And that's the moment where everybody picks up their phone.
Certainly, yeah. I think in a hyper-scheduled modern world, the idea of downtime or idle time in which nothing is happening, even for a couple of seconds, has become a somewhat terrifying thing for many of us. This feeling that, oh no, I don't have anything to do for 60 seconds. What will I use to fill it? And, fortunately for many of us, there's a device that we usually have there that is very handy for filling that time. But part of what I try to explore in the book is that we may not actually need the help of that device to fill the time. And on top of that, we might learn from the behaviors that we could develop if we resisted doing that.
In people hanging out, to what extent do you find that people need to justify it? That they need to find some reason why they're doing it, as opposed to just hanging out for its own sake?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it's a really important angle of what I try to think about and explore in the book. This sense that everything that we do has to be productive, that it has to have some sort of objective associated with it that is going to get us something or somewhere. And I think that enters into this feeling that hanging out has to be justified. There has to be some underlying rationale or some advantage that is going to come from doing it. And if we can't maybe measure that advantage, or if we can't see its effects very clearly or even materially, then we may come to question the purpose of hanging out itself.
And sometimes it's simply checking off that friend on your to-do list. I haven't talked to them in a while, or we haven't gotten together in a while. We need to do that. Did it? Check.
Yes, I know, which is a very sort of utilitarian way to go about thinking about our social interactions. But I think it's something that for many of us is a reality, too.
Talk a little bit about sense of place and the way in which place has an impact on all this, whether it's in a coffee shop or in somebody's home, etc.
Yeah, I think places and spaces as well can have a big impact on what happens when we hang out with each other. And in the book, I pick up on the sociologist Ray Oldenburg's theory of what he calls third places, which are places that exist apart from our first places, which are our homes, and our second places, which are our work. We can think of them as sort of like intermediaries. They're somewhere between home and work. We don't necessarily own them, but we enter into them. And when we're in those spaces, Ray Oldenburg points out that it's very important that they be free or low cost to enter into. When we're in those spaces, there's not a real set agenda for like how we have to be there or how we have to interact with others. And so there's more improvisation that is able to occur. And so I'm thinking of spaces like coffee shops, like libraries, like parks, like town squares, things like that, where we enter into these spaces without a sense that they are ours personally, that we're personally responsible for them, or that we own them, and that we therefore get to control them. And instead, we entered into them with this sense that, you know, what happens there is somewhat shared, and that we're not going to be able to control everything that occurs. This is really important, I think, for a functional democracy to have access to these kinds of spaces, and of course for a functioning society too. They're very important for hanging out because they allow people to hang out on a sort of like equal footing without someone else feeling like they have the final say or the final word over what happens in that space. Of course, though, the coffee shop eventually has to close and the workers have to go home. And at the same time, too, they facilitate this more improvisational kind of interaction, where people are kind of coming and going and they're passing through and they're having conversations with strangers or with neighbors or with people who they otherwise might not get to talk to very much. The problem, as I explore in the book, is that we are losing these spaces and we are losing these places. We are losing them mostly in favor of private spaces, which are harder to enter into and, of course, harder to hang out in.
Of course, coffee shops certainly are proliferating, and it's interesting that you talk about a third space because when Starbucks started, I mean, Howard Schultz talked a lot about Starbucks as being a third place. I mean, that was in some of the original literature about the company. And you know, the idea that it be someplace that isn't territorial is so interesting. I mean, it's very animal-like. I mean, you've got to find a place that's neutral territory to get together.
Right. And then, of course, you know, what's ironic about that, too, is, you know, some of us may remember the controversies that surrounded Starbucks in the 2010s surrounding who gets to be there and for how long. There was those occurrences that were much in the news about certain people being kicked out of Starbucks and also Starbucks, you know, locking down their bathrooms so that people couldn't access them, which made them, of course, much less into those kind of third places that Howard Schultz might have been originally interested in or may have been even idealizing. And it made them more into controlled spaces where certain people were allowed to exist there and be there and others were not.
Do you see an increase in hanging out on the part of young people today?
Not necessarily an increase in hanging out physically, but the young people that I interact with, certainly as a college professor, and I mostly interact with people who are between the ages of 18 and 24, so not necessarily very young, but for them, a lot of hanging out happens on the internet. And if it doesn't happen on the internet, it at least begins on the internet, and then it grows into something that happens elsewhere. And, you know, I have a chapter that's called Hanging Out on the Internet, where I try to explore some of these trends and talk about them. And I try to do so in a pretty, you know, judgment neutral way. I'm not necessarily trying to say that hanging out in this way is worse or is bad, only that I think it's sometimes lacking certain qualities that we get from hanging out in person. So we have kind of experienced this shift in our society where a lot of personal interactions or interpersonal interactions used to begin face-to-face in physical proximity, and then sometimes would sort of transfer over to the internet. And now it is more or less the reverse. Many of our social interactions begin on the internet, and they only sometimes materialize physically in the real world.
Right. The extension of that, and you see this, I mean, I've seen it among teenagers where they get together to hang out, And hanging out for them means they're all on their phone texting other people while they're all hanging out together.
Exactly. Although, to be fair, when I was a teenager growing up in the 90s, we did the same thing with the telephone at times too. And we would hang out in each other's bedrooms and we would call someone on the phone while the other person was either listening in or sitting there with us. So I get that these behaviors are not necessarily new, and I'm not trying to brand them as new and problematic in any particular way. But I'm more thinking about how things change when we transfer a lot of our hanging out activities to the internet. And one of the things that changes, of course, are our expectations about what we're able to control and curate for ourselves.
And finally, is there just a basic human need to do this, no matter how we do it, no matter how it ebb and flows, depending on technology and the time in which we live? I mean, we saw almost a desperate need for it in some quarters during the pandemic, that there is this basic human desire to do this.
I think so. I think there is a basic human desire to do it. And I'm skeptical of language that would call that desire, built in or hardwired or anything like that. But I think just over the social history of humans and how we've developed along with each other, we are social animals, and there is a desire for contact, for intimacy, and for exchange, for talking to somebody and have them talk back to us, and being able to participate in a somewhat casual and improvisational way in social life.
Sheila Liming, her book is Hanging Out: The Radical Power of Killing Time. Sheila, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you very much. This was fun.
Thank you.